Thank you for staying with News Central. Yesterday, November 20, campaigners assembled in 4 African countries and in Europe, rallying outside the headquarters of several Chinese financial institutions and embassies with one demand of Chinese officials: withhold financing for the East African crude oil pipeline, EACOP. Also known as the Uganda-Tanzania crude oil pipeline, EACOP aims to transport oil from Lake Albert in Uganda to the port of Tanga on the Tanzanian coast and on to international markets. Construction has already begun in western Uganda, and authorities are targeting commercial oil production by 2026. The protest yesterday is coming just days after a report by the international environmental watchdog Green Fate estimated over 2,000 graves in Uganda and Tanzania have been or would be affected by the pipeline. The figure was based on data from the operator and major shareholder owner, and that's Total Energies itself. Total Energies has denied disrespecting local customs in allegedly failing to protect hundreds of graves that would be touched by construction work. It also says an estimated 100,000 people displaced by the project have been fairly compensated and measures have been taken to protect the environment. Now, the New York City-based Green Fate adds to a long list of campaigners asking that the project be stopped. Human Rights Watch in July also urged a halt to the project. On the flip side, Ugandan President Yoweri Museveni has vowed to proceed. He says his country will enjoy an economic boost from the project. There are, of course, enormous potential in the East African Pipeline project. But there's also the question: is Uganda and Tanzania betting their respective future on a fuel that climate experts say is guaranteed to become obsolete? Let's look at the pros and cons in the second half of one slot. My guest is Matsiko Godwin Muhwezi, Energy and Extractives consulting partner, Matsiko Wanda and Arinda Advocates, Uganda. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
To bring us up to speed as to the benefits of the East African crude oil pipeline that President Museveni believes outweighs every other consideration.
Yes, absolutely. When you look at the history of a country like Uganda, ever since independence, we've had a lot of turmoil and governments have been changed through war. And so there's a lot of devastation, a lot of poverty in most of the country. And so for us, looking at oil as that, not as a magic bullet, but one of those opportunities that we have to leapfrog the economic situation that we are in, we feel that if we can just do it sustainably, it's an opportunity for us. So when we hear conversations about transition, the first point of call for us, and that's where President Museveni is talking about, is the transition out of poverty. We still have people who live below $2 a day. We have one of the youngest populations in the world. And we also need to remember that over 80% of the energy in the world is still fossil-based, and the transition that is talked about is going to take over 20 years. So for a country like Uganda and most of the global south, the biggest consideration for us is the transition out of poverty and how we can harness the resources we have, of course, sustainably, but making sure we can speak to what others have been able to enjoy before we can start thinking of alternatives.
I want you to speak on the ownership situation. In 2021, ownership of EACOP was Total Energies 65%, Uganda's national oil company 15%, Tanzania 15%, and then the CNOOC 5%. Could you share your thoughts on the ownership of these pipelines, considering that, it is going through Uganda and Tanzania?
Yes, so now it's 62%, 15%, 15% TBDC and CNOOC respectively, and then 8% for CNOOC. And so the question around that really is who bears the burden of the exploration. And we find that Total is putting a lot of revenue in the infrastructure that we are starting with. And so when you consider the cost oil and the length of them to recover the money, it just makes a lot of sense that we have most of the oil companies putting money up front and having that shareholding. But what remains is still enough for the countries, Uganda and Tanzania specifically, to be able to benefit. And bear in mind that Uganda also has reserved part of the oil and the option of setting up a refinery, which will be able to cater for the local market. So the shareholding is something to do with who is bearing the brunt of the investment at this point, but also to give opportunity for the project to move forward without worrying about domestic financing, which, as we know, is not readily available in countries like Uganda.
All right, because of the time we lost at the start of the conversation, I'm told we have barely 3 minutes to wrap up this conversation. So quickly as you can, in 40 seconds, what are the real cons of this project that is making campaigners so angry? How will the construction of the pipeline impact the environment and biodiversity in the region? I know there's very limited time. We'll probably need to come back to this conversation.
Yes, and I apologize for my network. So for the environment, obviously, where the pipeline is going to be routed, there's a lot of biodiversity. And what we have done is to make sure that the pipeline is underground. And part of the plan is to make sure we restore the environment after the pipeline to as much of it as possible as it was before. They have done as much as possible to make sure that they avoid the rivers and biodiversity, and then they have tried to make sure they compensate the people and move them sustainably. In Tanzania, compensation is about 99%. In Uganda, it's already 90%. We are avoiding flaring and making sure we do not destroy the environment. So as much as possible, the project partners are using best practices for environmental sustainability and will limit as much as possible the impact on the environment along the pipeline route.
All right, Matsiko, thank you very much for giving us your time. And hopefully we can revisit this conversation when we have a little more time to really unravel it. Thanks again.
Thanks, Felicity, for having me. Cheers.
And to you, our viewer, again, we apologize for the network interruptions. We hope, for the part of the conversation that was had, that something came through to you. Thank you very much for watching. The program returns next week. Bye for now.